everybody, and most welcome to the first webinar of the SSAHE. I'm very pleased to chair it. We have a panel of distinguished speakers whom I will introduce to you after I explain to you a little bit about our about SSAHE and also about the format of the meeting. SSAHE is a development of a group that first was formed in 2017 around what has come to be known the refugee crisis in Europe. A few of us who are fellows of the Academy of Social Sciences formed the group and organized a couple of public events as well as other activities. In the events, we analyzed the crisis, the global EU and UK context, as well as the ways that it related to wider issues of racism, migration, and of course, the hostile environment, so-called, which has become an integral part of settlement in the UK. As a step up of our activities, we decided to write a general report on the contribution of British social scientists to the understanding of these issues. So we wrote a report which talked about the relationship between racism and migration that often both politically and in the general public and as well as in the social sciences constituted separate conversations, and we emphasize the relationship about them. We also have shown how the so-called hostile environment was not invented by Theresa May, but it's something that has been part and parcel of the treatment of migrants, racialized minorities, and others for a very long time. Writing the report has been, for me at least, a wonderful experience of a collective writing. We talked about different forms of racialization and how it expresses itself in different fields: family, housing, employment, and education as illustrative case study. And we also looked at both extreme right and anti-racist movements. I really recommend you to look at the report. The report has been a collective effort of both member and non-members of the Academy, and from emeritus professor to early research, early career researchers, who all worked very hard without looking at issues of career promotion or what if, well, it's relevant to REF or not, but because they thought that the task is important. So we decided to rename ourselves as SSAHE, Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment, and see ourselves both as academic and an activist organization. We were all set to launch the report in a big 2 days conference when the pandemic struck. So we had to launch it softly just online. Since then, we have also written some blogs, and I would encourage you all to look at our website to read them. As you can see from the name of the web, the historical link with the Academy of Social Science is still there. So today is our first webinar, and hopefully the first of many. And what we would like to emphasize today, and it is an important day in which this is happening, because what has happened after the murder of George Floyd in the United States, both there and here and in many other places, there is an uprising against what the pandemic have highlighted in so many ways, as well has exposed and intensified the racialized inequalities as well as violence that are happening in our societies, and the reasons for which we analyzed also in the report as well as in other of our writings. So in this webinar, we are going to focus on the way that issues of migrant rights and refugee rights have been eroded, and why and what are the factors that affected them and the rise of hostile environment. Before introducing the speakers, I would like to apologize to people that because of the number of the attendees, we cannot make them asking questions after the presentation of the speakers, but rather ask them to write their questions via the chat. My co-chair, Rachel Humphreys, is going to collect the questions, probably group them as well, and after the 4 presentations will finish, then we will have short circles of questions and answers with the rest of the time of the webinar. So enjoy. Can I just ask all the speakers not to speak longer than the allocated time in order for us to be able to include as many questions and answers as possible. The first speaker is Don Flynn. He has been a great supporter and working with many of the people in SSAHE for many years. He has been very active in issues of migration in different organizations, from the Joint Council of the Welfare of Migrants to the Migrant Rights Network to the Permanent People's Tribunal. By the way, these organizations, as well as the British Sociological Associations, unlike the Academy for Social Science, did sponsor the report after they read it when we finished writing them. So the question or the topic that Don is going to talk about is the right-based approach to immigration policy and why it's stumbled. Don.
Okay, thanks, Nira, and thank you everybody for joining in this webinar today. I'm going to dive in and talk straight away about migrants' rights, which in this webinar appears in the title with a question mark after it in order to make the point. I think that it's a problematic idea, both in terms of the successes that have been achieved in all the years that it's been struggled for, but also the direction that it gives for the type of activities that we're talking about when we're combating the hostile environment and all the other issues that are going to be cropping up. But in itself, it ought to be a fairly simple idea. The idea of a struggle for rights pretty well follows the logic of most social struggles over the course of the 20th century, whether we're talking about civil rights in the anti-racist struggles in America, or women's rights or gay rights or whatever. And as it applies to migrants, I think basically what's being groped for there is the notion that there ought to be a space within their relations with government, the state policy, where the state is obliged to back off, that migrants can presume that they can pursue their legitimate interests in a manner which is consistent with notions of social justice, and that has to be respected. The state policies can go so far, but no further than this. They cannot infringe on this. And if we were to try and get an idea of what they mean in the context of migrants' rights, they probably cover things like where migrants stand at the border, their scope for being able to enter a country, the right to pursue economic opportunities in the country in which they're residing, the important issue of family reunification, and finally issues around equality of treatment, due process before the law, rights of appeal, and so on. All of these constitute some of the basic ideas behind migrants' rights. Now, there have been the strategies for campaigning for these sorts of concepts, and they go right the way back to the 1960s, when I think the first of the important anti-racist organisations, a campaign against racial discrimination, emerged. And one of the projects which it established was the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, which had specifically the job of looking at the way in which race discrimination operated within the field of immigration policy. And its first great battles that it had to take on were in relation to Kenyan and Ugandan Asians who were coming to the UK during that period. But by the 1970s, this had largely become a legal project. The main way in which the rights were advanced was looking for the ways in which, at that time, the English common law could be hammered into shape and made to provide a degree of protection. And that involved some of the significant achievements that were obtained at that time was, first of all, winning a right of appeal, because the legislation in the 1960s didn't have a right of appeal. But it was also trying to improve the quality of decision making by the immigration authorities, principally through judicial review. And so a whole area of activism in the legal field developed, which was later from the late 1990s onwards, it expanded, being able to take into account international human rights law as well, after the 1998 Human Rights Act came into force. Now, what were the problems with this way of fighting? Well, my view is that it never really managed to make the transition from legal action into political action. And by that, I mean it was never able to impress itself on the agendas of political parties who were likely, when on forming government, were likely to be changing the relationship between the state and migrants. The political parties were able to distance themselves from the activity that was being waging in appeals, law courts, all of these various things. And there was a unanimous approach, I think, across all the political parties that immigration could be reduced to this concept of firm but fair, with the real emphasis actually being placed upon the need to be firm with immigrants coming into the country. And it was extraordinarily difficult, I think, to try and prize the argument beyond that point and to make it into the sort of issue which previously had been capable of mobilizing people in trade unions, in other civil and human rights organizations, and making it a real contest in order to find a place on the political agenda. But having said that, there were areas of advance that were taking place, and they didn't particularly form part of the strategy of the migrants' rights organizations. And I think this particularly came in the form of the European Union, which completely blindsided everybody by coming up with a version of a immigration policy, which actually did tick most of the boxes for migrant rights. It provided a regime at the border in which migrants could be confident they could negotiate their way into the country. It provided a right to work, and it provided a right to equality of treatment and to family reunification. And I think for a group of activists who were around at that time began to think that maybe this was the way forward, that the missing part of our agenda was looking at the way the relationship between states effectively was forcing changes on the behaviours of national authorities and requiring them to accommodate the rights of migrants in some shape or form. And at this time, we're talking now in the 1990s, there were things coming on the agenda from lots of different directions. At the level of the United Nations, there was the adoption of a Convention on Migrant Workers' Rights in 1990, which itself had generated a lot of civil society activity. A global campaign for ratification of the convention came into existence in 1998, and was successful in getting states to sign up to it. And this then, the momentum for this bill carried on. There was a global commission on Kofi Annan's initiative, a global commission on international migration that met for 2 years, looking at the issues, why it was the case that so little was developing in terms of the rights of migrants. And this in turn led on to the Global Forum on Migration and Development, which located the whole issue of migrant rights within the broader framework of development issues. It posed questions like, if it is the case that we were going to be tackling global poverty, for example, and the global the Millennium Development Goals were an extremely important part of the international conversation at this point in time, then the question of the rights of people who are mobile, who are moving between countries, and who were contributing in various ways to development, had to be taken on board as well. And so this, in my view, this led to a lot of fairly fruitful work, certainly in terms of building up networks that went well beyond simply those of the global north. And it looked promising for a period, but it hit the buffers. And the reasons why it hit the buffers is because I think that it depended upon a fairly rosy view about the way global capitalism was developing at that point, a sort of the liberal notion that globalization would continue. It had liberal values embedded within it, and eventually these would extend to migrants. But then the crisis of 2008 badly disrupted that whole view of the way global capitalism was developing. That plunged into the Great Recession, and it led to populism emerging as a dominant, as an important discourse as far as politics were concerned. So that was probably the most significant part. If you want to look at what's been happening to migrant rights from round about that date, you see a complete reversal. The notion that embedded liberalism would have sufficient momentum to carry migrants' rights forwards completely ended. And in the UK and in most other parts of countries, you saw migrants' rights going into complete reverse. Rights that people thought they'd had for generations, the Windrush generation being the obvious example, were actually being taken away from them. So that's the stumbling part, how it stumbled. And I think I'm probably close to my 10 minutes now. So my concluding remark about this is that, did we learn anything during this period? And is the issue of migrants' rights still a useful way of trying to frame the route that we're going forward? And I think it still is. I mean, mainly because it's unavoidable. Without a concept of positively arguing for migrant rights, we're doing little more than a defensive guerrilla action trying to prevent things from getting worse. And unfortunately, the likelihood is that they always will get worse. But it does seem to me that the things that have been learned from it, though without the old illusions that we had in the past about embedded liberalism, is that it does have to be rooted within both the struggles at local community level also have to be rooted in the relationships between states and how they're likely to be configured in the future. And a fair amount of that is going to be arising from the way Brexit is going to shape up, and COVID-19 as well, the implications that that's got. But I think probably my final remark, and I'll leave this hanging in the air, but we are always going to be surprised about the direction that discussions about migrant rights are coming from. And here we have, at the moment, probably one of the biggest shake-ups that we've had in a long while, and as that is we're at the point of discussing the possibility that some 3 million residents of Hong Kong actually might be acquiring rights to come to the UK. Again, something that nobody had anticipated. but it was something that was generated by a crisis that is being posed at the global level, at the national level, in relationships between states. And it continues to provide us with opportunities in which we can make our demand for the rights of migrants concrete and really applicable. I'll finish on that. I think
they raised the issues that we are going to discuss later. By the way, for those of you who find it difficult to take notes during webinar, this whole session is being recorded and will be available afterwards on our website. We'll let you know about that. The next speaker is Adam Hanieh, who is a co-chair of the SOAS Center for Migration and Diaspora Studies. He is well known for his writings on the political economy and analysis of the Middle East, and recently on global migration. And the title for his presentation today is The Contradictions of Global Migration in Pandemic Times. Adam, the floor is yours. If Nando will give you the floor, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Nira, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I think it's a wonderful and much useful initiative. I want to focus my brief comments today on what migration can tell us and reveal about the particular moment that we're currently living through, i.e. a moment of very deep, multiple intersecting crises, obviously the pandemic uppermost within this, but also an economic crisis, a crisis of political legitimacy, which we can see globally, ecological crises, and so forth. So what can migration tell us about this particular moment? I want to speak generally, but I do want to refer, and a lot of what I say is going to be drawn upon my own region of interest and research, which is the Gulf Arab states in the Middle East. And part of this is the question of labor migration to the Gulf. I actually think there's a lot that can be learned about the concept of the hostile environment from looking at the Gulf states, and I hope to just mention a few points on this today. So I want to make three basic points. The first point is in relation to how migration is typically framed in public discussions, in public discourse. And here I think there's two basic positions that we can discern. On the one hand, we have obviously the very pronounced growth of xenophobia, national chauvinism, right-wing racism in all its variants. This is clearly a feature of the moment, the political moment. What these movements do is position migration as central to all political speech. So whether it's debates around national security, debates around economic growth, crime, erosion of public services, even ecological sustainability, they are inevitably framed by these movements as a question of migration, as an issue of migration. And I think in response to this, and here I want to echo a lot of what Don has said, a second basic approach to migration in the public discourse is more of the a liberal one that seeks to reassert a universalism based on human rights and international norms, emphasizing respect for the dignity of refugees and other kinds of migrants, and the meeting of government obligations under international law. Now, while this second position does, I think, play an important role in providing a counterweight to the racist stereotyping and racist discussions we often see around migration, I think this second position is nonetheless highly problematic. And specifically, the reason for this is I think that this kind of liberal argument is often based on a nationalist perspective in which migration is judged from the perspective of what is supposedly good or bad for us. understood within the national border. So, you know, we often hear justifications for migration based around, you know, bringing us needed skills or entrepreneurial dynamism, demographic growth, increased consumer demand, all of these kinds of ways that migration is often seen from this perspective. And I think the problem with this kind of approach is it reinforces this distinction between the good and the bad migrant. In contrast, I think it's very important to foreground a global understanding, an understanding of global capitalism that links the wealth and accumulation of places like the UK with things happening in the rest of the world, the immiseration of other countries globally. So what Britain, United States, and other wealthier states do overseas, and I'm not just speaking here about war or about military intervention, but also the multiple ways of the way that financial and political structures globally actually work in peaceful times, that this is part of how dispossession takes place and how what generates migration and cross-border movements in the first place. So I think, and again, echoing Don's point, the idea that a defense of migrants needs to move beyond just a question of international law and humanitarianism to look at these kinds of global issues. So that's my first point. The second point I want to make is that I think we need to foreground much more centrally how migration is part of the way that class comes into existence and is made today. This is not something new, obviously. It's something we know historically, certainly in this country from colonialism. But I do think globally we often forget or overlook this point today. And I think, in fact, the pandemic really highlights why this is so important. Because I think very often when we think about the category of class or of labor, we, in our minds, and certainly this is part of the public discourse, is that we restrict it to those who have citizenship or those who are contained within the national borders. And I think one of the things we need to do is break with this idea that class is just those who have this kind of national identity or citizenship rights. I think we saw this very clearly in the Brexit debate, where migrants were not seen as being part of the working class. Certainly not those migrants that don't have citizenship here in this country. This is, I mean, from my own work, I think this is really key in terms of understanding how labor and notions of the working class in the Gulf is understood. Because here you have a place where 2/3 of the population are temporary labor migrants, and yet they are absolutely essential to how labor takes place. 2/3 of the labor force in the Gulf are non-citizens, temporary migrant workers. So the third point that I think is really important to raise, particularly at this moment, is that migration is really key to how crises get transmitted globally. I've mentioned, you know, the Gulf in this respect, and I think we can see here how the Gulf prefigures a lot of the trends we can see elsewhere in the world. As I said, you know, around 2/3 of the labor force in the Gulf is made up of temporary migrant workers. It's the second largest source of remittances in the world. It's the largest destination of South-South migration in the world. And what we are now seeing with the COVID pandemic, and also with the decline in oil prices and the economic crisis, that we're seeing mass deportations of migrants in the hundreds of thousands from the Gulf regions back to countries of origin in South Asia, the Middle East, East Africa, and further afield. Now, I think this is really important to kind of foreground, because what this shows is the way that migration and the movements of people across borders and corridors of remittance flows actually become transmission belts for crises globally. What is happening in the Gulf is that this moment is actually being felt much more severely, not inside the borders of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and so forth, but actually in the countrysides of Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, East Africa and elsewhere. This is a transmission or a displacement of crisis onto these neighboring states. So I think the Gulf is just one example here, but I think this is a really important way of thinking about crisis. Again, breaking with this kind of methodological nationalism or nationally centered perspectives on how we understand these processes. There's a lot more that I can say about specifically the way COVID and the virus is impacting workers and migrants in the Gulf. There's also a lot that can be said about the kinds of migration management and the control of borders and infrastructure in the Gulf, and the way this does parallel, I think, the hostile environment in this country. But perhaps we can leave that to discussion. The last thing I'll say before winding up, just one final comment, is that I really think when we're talking about these kinds of concepts, we need to move our discussion away from solely perspective on Europe or perspective on North America, to try to see what we can learn from migration flows in the South, not just from South to North, but within South-South migration flows. I think there's a lot that can be said about what we can learn from these types of movements of people. So I'll leave it there, and thank you again for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you very much, Adam. And of course, this displacement in countries like India don't only happen across borders, but also between the city and the countryside. But we will talk about it. Our next speaker, Heaven Crowley, who was originally part of our Academy refugee group, is actually most interested in the South-South migration issues that you just talked about, Adam. She is a professor of international migration at Coventry University and director of the Migration for Development and Equality Hub. And her presentation today, which fits very well to the issues that both Don and Adam raised, is refugee, migrant, neither, both, the use and abuse of categories to marginalize and exclude. So Heaven, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nira, for the introduction, and thank you, Adam and Don, for the comments before. I think, as Nira said, many of my comments will hopefully build on some of those. I'm going to talk specifically about this issue of what I and others have called categorical fetishism, which is to say that this way in which categories are used and abused, I would argue, as a sort of mechanism for inclusion and conversely, increasingly, exclusion. And this paper that was published on this theme drew on the research that we'd done in relation to the so-called European migration crisis or refugee crisis. But actually what I want to say draws on research over a much longer period of time, actually 25, 30 years, during which I think this has been a recurrent theme, the way in which categories are employed by different constituencies in different ways to manage, if you like, in terms of the migration process, but also shape and orientate power in a way that allows some people to be able to access rights, other people to be excluded from them, and of course the broader process of migration control. And categories, of course, are not something that are new to social science discussion. They're not something that we can necessarily move away from. But I think what's interesting about the notion of categories is that the focus tends to be on the category itself, rather than on the politics of the boundaries which are put in place to create the category. And for me, it's that politics of bounding is where our power potentially as social scientists, as advocates, as organizers of various kinds lies, because the contents of the category are fixed in other ways, but they are never fixed permanently. They change over space and time. And I wanted to give you some examples of that from the UK context. So For example, when I first started working in this area in the late 1980s, we were working a lot around issues of gender persecution in relation to the experiences of specifically refugee women's legal group, but we were looking more generally at how gender is understood as part of the process of needing to seek international protection and then being included or excluded from that protection. And in that context, as with much of boundaries that are created around categories, you have these dichotomies that are constructed, often very artificially, against which the categories are formulated. So in this case, the public and the private, the notion of private violence versus public violence, state versus non-state. These are ways of framing people as being in or out, and they're deeply gendered as processes, and we identified the ways in which that happened in relation to refugee women at that time and tried to challenge the boundaries of that through litigation and other means. I worked for the Home Office for some time, and we saw within the Home Office processes, and again, both Don and Adam have alluded to this, the way in which policy is constructed around notions of the good migrant, the bad migrant, and how categories of asylum, economic migration, family reunion, students, and of course nationality categories are then framed in relation to these kind of broader political discourses. And then a lot of the work that I've done around issues of children and childhood, again, we see categories being utilized as a mechanism for excluding certain groups. So if we look at the way in which children and young people are presented as being inside or outside the boundaries of what we consider to be childhood, this is again a kind of tool, a lever that's used to exclude some children and include others, particularly through the process of age disputes and disputed issues around identity and around whether a child is or is not in fact considered to be a child. So in all of those cases, we see examples of categories being utilized as a process, a mechanism for exclusion. And this is exactly what we saw in the so-called migration crisis in Europe. Again, this positioning of the migrant versus the refugee, which is nothing new, but in that particular context, you had this very explicit and often kind of represented in the media as well, use of these categories to say that some movements are legitimate and not others. So we had Al Jazeera refusing to use the category migrant and the BBC refusing to use the category refugee, because each was seen to represent something about the legitimacy or otherwise of the flow. So my point in all of this is that these categories are not static, fixed, or natural. They move about and are shaped by the political interests and the power dynamics of the struggle around notions of legitimacy and illegitimacy in relation to migration. And one of the things that became very clear from our research around the Mediterranean migration crisis, so-called, was something that we've known for a very long time, and we know not just to be true in Europe but elsewhere, that the more convoluted and complex migration journeys have become by virtue of the increasing complexity and increased controls, in fact, over that movement, the more likely it is that people move within, between, and betwixt these categories. People can begin their life or their journey as a refugee fleeing a conflict of some kind, find themselves in protracted displacement elsewhere, be struggling to make a livelihood, get access to rights of citizenship or otherwise, be forced to move on effectively by lack of that possibility, and then become reclassified by somebody as an economic migrant. And so it can happen that somebody is simultaneously a refugee and a migrant on a singular so-called journey, but a journey that might take place over 5 or 10 years. Equally, somebody can begin their journey from a West African country, find themselves in Libya looking for work, and very quickly become embedded in systems of structural discrimination and violence, which position them more as a refugee by virtue of the kind of human rights violations and protections that they need. So the point of all of this is not that, as I say, categories don't exist, but that the way that the boundaries of those categories are constructed and who they're constructed by, importantly, which is not migrants themselves or refugees themselves, but people who have positions in power, that political process is one that reflects deep-seated structural inequalities and injustices. It's not a kind of given that people are in these categories and simply, you've got to work out which category they fit into. The categories are themselves designed to include and exclude, and they're deeply racialized and deeply gendered in ways that we've been hearing about today. So what are the implications of that? Well, I think the first thing that we as academics, as social scientists, as advocates need to do is to really challenge the boundaries. Not just the content of the boundaries, but the way in which the boundaries are constructed. We can do that through litigation, we can do that through advocacy. There's lots of ways we can challenge the construction of the boundaries that are designed to exclude. But I think the key is not exclusively to work on boundaries that are set in relation to migration, because the important point of what Don was saying, and also Adam to a significant extent, was that there are things that connect people, many things that connect people, that have nothing to do with the migration categories that are designed to exclude. And so finding ways of building these transnational solidarities, both across countries but also within them, around things, around social injustices, around inequalities that connect people, gets us away from the ideas of categories themselves as being the way in which we organize our society, because categories are often, as I say, politically constructed for other reasons. And that in a way brings me on to my final point, which is I think that we also need to be very careful about how we ourselves utilize categories. We know that we use categories ourselves in our writing, in our advocacy, in our political mobilization, and we do that for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes we do that because one of the ways to mobilize power for groups that are disempowered is to highlight their victimhood by virtue of being in that category. And so we ourselves reproduce the categories and in turn kind of reinforce the boundaries of the category by asserting that certain groups of people are something, as if it's they that are something rather than the systems that place them in a certain way within our societies. So I think there's a real danger, although I understand the motivations behind doing it, of us ourselves utilizing those categories to try and mobilize forms of resistance, if what they do is actually artificially constrain the possibilities of the people in those categories and reduce the potential to build solidarities across groups. And so for me, I think categories, it's very easy to say, oh, it's the politicians, the media, the legal processes, they're the problems, they have these categories, we don't like them, they position people in a certain way that disempowers them. But we, in our various forms, are also part of those structures. And so we have to really think carefully about how we ourselves engage with and work with those categories in ways that could potentially, if unintentionally, exclude and marginalize as well. I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heaven. I think that the importance of resisting essentialism and homogenization as ways of exclusion is very important in all the issues that we are talking about. And no doubt we will continue to discuss it both in the next presentation and in the discussion that will follow. Our last but not least presenter is Eleanor Kaufman, who also has been one of the co-authors of SSAHE's report. She is a professor of gender, migration and citizenship in Middlesex University. The title of her presentation is Equality Without Rights, Migration and Settlement Policies Post-Brexit.
Thanks very much, Neera. Can I say the title is slightly different? It's Equally Without Rights rather than Equality.
Oh, sorry. Oh.
Yeah, very important.
Equally.
I'd like, yes. I'd like to take up particularly follow on from Heaven's talk and also take up some of Don's points in looking at the issue of using categories. But what I'd like to do is to turn my attention to a kind of a binary, which is also being picked up in some of the points on chat. And it's this notion of the distinction between the skilled and the supposedly less or lower skilled, or what I can't stand is unskilled. But I think what I'm arguing is that this is basically the underpinnings of so many migration policies, of this supposed ability to cut through these differences. And what I'm going to be arguing is that, to bring in, which again, one or two speakers have talked about, is both Brexit and COVID, and look at how my argument is that actually Brexit will, in effect, reduce everyone who is migrants, both from the EU and the non-EU, to the same lack of rights. And that's why I've called it equally without rights. And I think it's something I'm not here talking about, precisely coming back to what Don is talking about, that it's a matter, it's a legal issue. I think this is a campaigning issue, which I want to get to by the end. And the point is that I think that what we need to remember is that all non-EU migrants, whether in fact they be skilled or not skilled, whether they're labor migrants, family migrants, humanitarian, are placed in a precarious and a temporary position. In particular, we have the word probationary, and these migrants all have to go through a probationary period, which has been reinforced by the Conservative government since 2010, was something that has actually, I think, generated less attention than issues around entry. And here I'm talking about the attempt by the Conservative government to de-link entry with settlement. And this delinking of entry and settlement is what's totally behind the hostile environment, because as they tried to delink with more and more restrictive policies, the more they made the environment hostile to deter people from wanting or being able to actually settle in the country. Now, what I want to firstly do is to outline the proposals for the future Brexit post-transition policy, which is it's essentially, and it's again being noted in chat, being based on this clear and very sharp distinction between the high-skilled and the low-skilled. Though, as we shall see also, the high-skilled in the new Conservative proposals actually takes in some of the medium. And it's very interesting, we never talk about the medium. I then want to look at some of the problematic issues of the differential valuing of skills between what you could call codified and embodied skills, or soft skills, and their implication for a future migration policy post the transition period from January 2021. And so my point here is that basically the same restrictions and the same hostile environment will apply both to EU and to non-EU migrants. As the EU, as basically the UK withdraws from the kind of the regional sovereignty of the EU space, and it goes back to so-called taking back control within a very imperial and global voyage in the future. Now, my argument here, of course, is that both sources of labor will be equally commodified. I then consider after that what, in a sense, our response, or what some of the responses might be post-COVID-19, in the way that so certain workers have been classified as key workers and as essential workers, but in effect, they belong to the so-called less desirable, low-skilled. But I also ask myself to what extent we may be, in effect, able to campaign against this distinction, which some people have felt might well happen as a result of COVID, given that the UK's government is very ideologically attached to searching and recruiting the brightest and the best. And I'll lastly look at the care sector as one which might give us some purchase on on trying to change the discourse of the unrewarding, undervalued, basically problematic, less skilled migrant. So as is some of the points made in the chat already, we do actually have a points-based system already, which was promoted or implemented by the Labour government and then made much more restrictive by the Conservatives, and it became effectively a graduate scheme. And it was also followed at the same time, and again, this was part of this hostile environment, the minimum income requirement from 2012. So all of these, again, are about getting the right kind of migrant, the migrant who's earning enough, the migrant who's not supposedly a burden. Now, in terms of the modified system that's been introduced through the immigration bills so far, we read that for too long the government has said, distorted by European free movement rights, the immigration system has been failing to meet the needs of the British people, failing to deliver benefits across the UK, and failing the highly skilled migrants from around the world who want to come to the UK and make a contribution to it. And as a result of that, of course, we will replace the UK's the free movement with the points-based system. So what is, very briefly, the points-based system? It's one, again, which will have a minimum income, but there is to be, and they have actually asserted this again, there is to be absolutely no route for the lesser skilled. And again, I would argue this represents a fixation with global sourcing of the skilled and an attack on low-skilled migrants, which was particularly strong in the Brexit debate and seeing the low-skilled as being the real problems. If you remember, Farage didn't think that the high-skilled were a problem at all. Now, in terms of how we can in a sense, argue against this clear demarcation, we could take the care work or the care sector, which illustrates some of the weaknesses of the above argument. So it's been actually contested, the whole notion of care as not being worthy of being allowed to enter into the UK for work purposes goes back to the Labour PBS system already in 2005. Because in fact, the problem with care work is that it isn't based on formal qualifications, i.e. Michael Polanyi's concept of coded of knowledge and based on formal qualifications, but it's much more using tacit or embodied skills or soft skills. Now, it's of course an overwhelmingly female occupation. The pay is low. And indeed, what we see now is that care workers are often paid less than a supermarket cashier. This is a situation where, despite the value of care work, the Migration Advisory Committee has relentlessly and opposed any kind of initiative which would allow care workers to qualify for any kind of PBS. Despite the shortages. And indeed, they've made the argument we should not be using immigration legislation to solve shortages and conditions in a particular sector. My response here might be, well, they don't say the same thing for doctors and nurses, which are also shortage occupations. So we have a slightly different view of what they see as valued occupations. So my second point here is that from January 2021, new EU citizens will also be recommodified to the same extent as non-EU, as they move from being fellow EU citizens to commodified mobile workers. So they too will confront, in effect, the same hostile environment. No recourse to public funds, the health surcharge, except for possibly those in the health sector, the same minimum income requirements to bring in family members, and virtually impossibility to bring in adult dependent relatives. So what this will do is to, of course, push EU migrants into the same kind of precarity and temporariness, both of their working lives and of their everyday lives. Now, what has happened, and this is my last point here in terms of COVID, what has happened as a result of COVID is that suddenly we have the realization that those who ensure that we can be safe, we can be secure, are not only the highly skilled of the population, but they're also workers who are poorly remunerated, have less formal qualifications, etc., including, of course, care workers. But within this whole supposedly low skilled, we have, in fact, carers, delivery people, and all the workers in the food chain, as well as, of course, those who've been classically conceptualized as the highly skilled, i.e. doctors and nurses. However, as we've seen, many of these key and essential workers do not fit into the proposals for a post-Brexit migration policy, which, as I've said several times already, is fixated by this global competition for the brightest and the best, and prioritizing coded knowledge and formal qualifications. So the question is, will we return to the rejection of low-skilled migrants, presented as culturally problematic and unable to integrate? Because in fact, when you look at the arguments in the minimum income requirement for having a high minimum income, it was much more strongly based on integration. So this is the idea that the skill that you have, and in fact, also to reset the class position, is what determines whether you are likely to be part of us and worthy of being able to enter the UK labour market and UK society or not. Now, as I say, possibly the one sector that one might, in campaign terms, have the ability to argue against this clear distinction might be the care sector for the reasons that I've already outlined. But I also want to make the point here that this is not just about migrants, and I think we've all been talking about this, is not that we need to go beyond this. In effect, what I would argue is that in order to make this campaign have any kind of validity and success possibly, we need to ensure that the care sector should overall be better regulated, better remunerated, and have a clear career structure. So what I'm arguing here, as with Heaven, is that we really need to think very carefully about the categories that we're using, but the artificiality of these sharp distinctions between the categories. What are the implications of using these categories for migration? And lastly, picking up also on Don's point, is to look at the issue of campaigning and what we can do as campaigning. Now, I know, unlike Adams, I have been talking about the national level, but I thought that each of us, you know, in a sense, needs to address different elements of this question of are there migrant rights? And I would say that I would actually maybe shift not from policies to politics, but to my argument is the problem is that politics are really determining the kinds of policies that we have, obviously. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Thank you very much, all the speakers. I think you've all raised some very important issues, both strengthening each other and complementing each other. Of course, I have lots to say about everything, but I'm going to shut up and to give the floor to Rachel, the co-chair, who is going to voice what were the questions and the comments of the audience. So, Rachel, the floor is yours.
I'm unmuted. Thanks very much, Nira, and thanks to all the speakers. I found that so fascinating. And also thanks to all of the participants who've been posting some really fascinating chats and sharing their ideas through the chat function. So I will just go through and summarize one question for each of the speakers, and then maybe we'll come back for another round. But if you do have more questions as you're thinking about the presentation, then please do post those in the chat as well. So firstly, to Don, if you could reflect on the problem at the EU level, both the contrast between the formal proclamation of migrants and refugee rights and the development of the security apparatus to fight irregular migration on the other side. So that kind of tension within the EU policies on migration. And then to Adam, if you could reflect on the additional problem of how EU policy has operated also to disrupt virtuous South-South migration circuits. So the role of the EU in disrupting virtuous South-South migration circuits. And then to Heaven, if you know of any research on how those different categories affect migrants' perceptions of belonging and integration, so how migrants themselves utilize and leverage those categories that you highlighted, and if you know of any instances where those categories cease to operate in the statuses of migrants and how that might come about and the implications of those shifting categories. And Anna, I think people are still thinking about your about your topic. There was a chat to try to highlight the comprehensive sickness insurance criteria that is being applied on EU migration, and obviously the effect more generally of the points-based system post-COVID, post-Brexit. There is also a general question, if you want to address it, if there is it's about categorizations really, and if there's a tension between our academic categories and activist categories, and how in activist work, how we might have to reinforce, reify, or reproduce some potentially harmful narratives, and how we can navigate that both as academics and in our support for activist and our own direct action work. So that's the first round. So perhaps Don first, if you want to comment.
Okay, am I unmuted now? Yeah, okay, yes, thanks for the question. The problem of the EU and the contrast between on one hand, the apparent liberality of free movement rights contrasted with the strictness and the harshness of external migration, the closed EU borders. And I think that's arisen because the fact that the free movement rights didn't actually arise as they were never presented as being a migrants' rights issue. They arose out of very orthodox economic, the European Union was designed primarily by economists around the issue of the single market. And it's what present themselves as rights for migrant workers from the EU arose as from the mobility of the factors of production. That if you're going to have an area where there was a free movement for goods and capital and services, and labour had to be there as well. So it was almost accidental that this regime of migrants' rights actually unfolded for those people who were migrating as EU nationals between member states. And the external border migration came from a completely different logic. It was, I mean, for one thing, it was no longer under the control of the European Commission, who were the principal movers and shakers when it came to the policies of a single market. But it was now had to be considered by each of the member states. And the European Commission found it, I don't want to come across as an apologist for the European Commission at all, but they obviously found it extremely difficult in order to with concepts like burden sharing and properly managing the flows of refugees across the Mediterranean area, simply because any one of the member states could throw a spanner in the works at any point in time. And that had the effect of them struggling to design a policy which basically appealed to the lowest common denominator, and something which everybody could sign up to, which even then they completely failed to do, because there was always a Hungary or whoever somewhere down the line who was prepared to say not even that. So that's it. It's two different dynamics. The migration of people within the European Union, the free movement rights arose from the single market agenda, whereas the external migration took a different route. It was tied up with security and all the traditional concerns that national states have when it comes to policing borders.
Thanks, John. And Adam, would you like to address your question?
Yes. Yes, thanks for that question. And thanks to the other presenters for some really fascinating presentations. I think it's certainly true, particularly over the last decade. We can see the way that these kinds of south-south migration patterns around the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the African continent as a whole have been very much disrupted and integrated into the EU. I think labour markets is a really big part of this. Obviously, we see this through the externalisation, border externalisation policies, which particularly since the Arab uprisings, 2010, 2011, have been, I think, a clear feature of EU negotiation with each of those countries in North Africa. I highlight in particular here Libya, where Libya really has been long played a role as kind of a place of containment of populations from the European perspective. But I think it's clear in just the last few years that so many of people displaced across the Mediterranean into the European Union have become again, as some of the other speakers noted, like incorporated into certain types of work, and really disrupting this idea of refugees as a specific category, and workers and migrant workers as another separate category. That we look at, for example, agricultural work in parts of Southern Europe, and the way that people displaced across the Mediterranean are often really central to those processes. So I would certainly agree with the comments people have made about needing to reject this kind of sharp dichotomy between economic migrant or a refugee, and to look at the way that people move, and these categories are actually very much constructed.
Mm. Thanks, Adam. A lot of chat about categories, categorization, the fuzziness around these boundaries. Heaven, would you like to address your question and all of the intricacies around this?
Yeah, I mean, I was just watching the chat, actually, as you say, lots of different points around this issue of categories. In terms of the question, I suppose I wanted to start really with a general point. So ultimately, we're all human beings and we all have multiple identities. So sometimes I'm a mother, sometimes I'm a grandmother, sometimes I'm a migrant. I live in Italy, I'm a migrant. Sometimes I'm a professor. So we all have these different categories which we ourselves align with and choose to be part of, and in which we are also put or positioned by others. That's no different for migrants. Migrants have their migrant category or identity, which at points in time becomes more pressing or important, particularly in relation to border entry and in terms of legal processes, because that fixes people very securely in certain categories, and they therefore need to comply with certain requirements of those categories to secure entry or to maintain rights within a context. But those people who are migrants are also mothers, grandmothers, family members, old, young, children, young people. They are also multiply in other categories. And so the fixation with their migrancy category is not necessarily always prevalent or pervasive for them or for me, in my case, as individual migrants, but it comes to be important at different points. Sometimes it's made to be important by others. So if I, as a researcher, ask somebody to talk about their experience of migration, I'm privileging their migrant-related aspects of their identity. Or I remember very much from the work with young people, talking to young people about their age and their age assessment, their age disputes. And some of those young people just thinking that wasn't really the most important thing for them. But as a researcher, I thought it was the most important thing. Other people, advocates, might want people to fit within other certain categories in order to provide services or to undertake advocacy of certain types. And as people have noted in the comments, migrants as individuals also leverage those identities as part of their own communities within and outside those communities for different purposes. So we're back to this issue about non-essentializing categories. It's not that categories are singularly problematic. They are a fact of life and we utilize them in different ways. My issue really is the fact that within research, but in the broader sense of how we talk and think about migration, we tend to think and talk about them in very fixed ways, often because we're focusing on a particular problem or a particular issue where that category has become problematic. But I think in so doing, we kind of remove the agency of the people involved, as well as the potential for this sort of cross-cutting intersectional solidarities that I was talking about earlier, which I guess, if I may, just brings me onto that point about, is there a tension between an activist and an academic? I mean, for me, no, absolutely not. And I think for many academics and activists who are both simultaneously, that's not the case. But it really depends on whether, as Eleanor suggested, you want to focus on politics or policy, or whether you think politics are the problem here, or it's, you know, a question of just coming up with a better policy based on clearer categories. And if you think the categories themselves are contestable, then that takes you into a different territory in terms of how you position yourself in relation to that. In that case, I don't think it matters if you're an academic or an activist. You can be both at the same time. And all the better if you are, in a sense, because we have power and privilege that we can harness in order to challenge some of those things that other people potentially don't. So that's my take.
Thanks very much. Anna, do you want to comment on that, and also on maybe on the categorization and the kind of the movement into our post-Brexit future?
Okay, it's been difficult unmuting. So actually, I understood the question about categories and academics and activists in a slightly different way. And I think one of the big problems that many of us have had as academics is being forced, and particularly often for funding reasons, to use the categories the state imposes. And it's the state that is, of course, imposing these categories. And I think one of the comments also in the chat was about the process, which can be important also for moving from being irregular. Again, we've had lots of discussions about what word do we use, undocumented, irregular, etc. So I think that there's a lot of, there's also a lot of discussion to be had about what categories we use. Now, we can't, I think, as Heaven has said, get away from using categories, but I think we do need to realize they're very complex. People may have different senses of belonging, different categories that they attach to themselves, and that is equally of migrants who may be, of course, forced to embrace certain categories by others. So, of course, it's not what category you choose necessarily, it's what do others, and that's the state, but communities and other individuals impose upon you, and how do you react to those categories? And I think that's also very important. I don't know if there were, on the PBS, I'm not quite sure what the questions were.
I think that may have been before you gave your presentation.
Okay, fine. That's great.
I realise that we may not have time for all the presenters to have a full round of new questions, but there has been one that maybe they want to comment on about how do we move away from category-based struggles to social or rights-based ones when the political agendas of the states drive the exclusion by category. And also we may want to open this up more to some of the other things that you might have wanted to discuss in your presentations around how the state might be reconfigured post-COVID, and in the UK post-Brexit, and what opportunities and extra challenges that might mean for migrants' rights. So if you would like to discuss or reflect on that question, how we move away from category-based struggles to social or rights-based ones when we are faced with these particular political agendas, and maybe the potentials for COVID or the challenges that COVID presents. Does any of the speakers, Don?
Unmute him.
Nando, try and unmute all the speakers so that it will save time. We have only 5 minutes. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. On categories and how do you transform them into rights struggles. I mean, I suppose my feeling on that is that it's a bit like what they say about generals fighting their strategies for fighting wars and how their best plans don't survive the point of first contact with the enemy. And I feel that pretty much about categories when they become embedded within immigration policy and they're reflected in all the complexities of points-based schemes and all the sets of regulations that apply to the different categories within the points-based schemes, is that they will not survive point of first contact with the reality of migration. And you know, that's pretty well what's happened. I think it happened to the 2005 points-based scheme which Labour tried to introduce, which basically had a very important safety net under it, and which meant that undocumented, that so-called unskilled migrants were able to come within the EU categories. But if you took that away from it and you introduced a much more rigid system, which basically presumes that the state is all-knowing, that the state has at any one point in time a perfect knowledge about the state of the economy, what its requirements are in terms of all the different skill sets that exist there, and how those skill sets fit into the teams that are supposed to be working on different projects. My view is it's not going to be too long before we start finding, as we found during the COVID-19 crisis, all sorts of categories of people who were considered by the authorities not to be worthy of being included within the scheme suddenly start appearing as key workers, absolutely essential if the teams which support our health are going to continue. So I'm not particularly daunted by the prospect that is there and it's embedded within the immigration control system. In many ways, I think the rigidity that they insist that the system operates with means that it's a brittle system, and it's going to start generating conflicts and plenty of opportunities for campaignings on rights-based issues as soon as we start moving into that.
Thanks, Don. Adam, Heaven, Eleanor?
Yeah.
Yeah, Adam?
Yes, yeah, just very quickly on that. I think coming back to a point that I made in my presentation, I think the question of the global, looking at kind of the global processes that generate movements of people, undermine and dispossess people. I think this is a very clear example of where we can move beyond the question of categories to look at and challenge kind of socioeconomic and questions of power and wealth globally as a question of migrant rights and refugee rights. Tackling those kinds of issues to me is a really important place to start. We can't just look at what happens at the border. We need to look at what happens way before the border, and that means looking at these kinds of questions. I mean, there's David Bacon, who's written a lot about US or Mexican migration to the United States, has a nice phrase, I think, the right to stay home. And he talks about the way that because of the undermining of the right to stay home, it's made the movement of people and so much more perilous. So I think looking at those kinds of global questions really is key to moving beyond just the question of categories.
Yeah, and my point would be very similar, building on from that, really. It's around focusing on these structural inequalities at a global level, obviously, in terms of what capitalism is doing and the kind of imperatives of capitalism, essentially to keep generating and regenerating inequality. That's how it survives and indeed thrives. And I think if COVID-19 has done anything, it's done what Arundhati Roy says is sort of create an X-ray effect in sort of revealing the skeleton of this inequality. And some of what we're seeing in terms of the responses to migrants in various contexts, and Adam, you talked about them in the Gulf, but we only have to look also at what's happening in India, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and elsewhere. These are not new processes. They're an exaggeration of the existing processes, both in terms of the movements, but also in terms of the treatment and the arbitrary nature in which migrants get treated in these particular contexts. So the starting point has to be not the categories, but the structural inequalities of which the categories are a reflection. And ultimately, it's addressing the structural inequalities that underpin those and enable and facilitate those categories to be present, including patriarchy and racism, clearly, which are very prevalent in the way in which the categories are constructed, which feels like a very, very big challenge for sure, but one which multiple people well beyond the migrant population have an interest in addressing. So that's how you create that solidarity, by the shared interest of multiple constituencies and not just migrants themselves in tackling the structural inequalities that marginalize so many within that global system, and not just a supposed minority of migrants whose rights can be sort of discarded because they're inconsequential in some way. We're all equally or differentially, but in some way incorporated into the structure.
Eleanor, I saw it to very quick.
No, very quickly, yes. I mean, agreed about the inequalities, but I think we also need to think about what are we going to do with them and how are we going to try to leverage precisely the realization of these inequalities, because I think that's what COVID has done, but whether we'll act upon that is another, globally, but also nationally, is another question. And that's, I think, a bit of skepticism here.
Okay. I'm afraid that our time is up. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. And the discussion is just getting going. I would like to, as I said, we are going to record both the chat and of course the papers and to distribute it to everybody. But I would like to encourage the people who have listened and who have a lot to say about these issues to write blogs and to send it to us in order to put on our website so that the discussion can continue in this way. And I would like to thank all the speakers, all the organizers of this event, and let's continue the struggle as well as the analysis and get together again in future webinars and future activisms. And goodbye. Thank you.